Thanks, Ralph.
Good morning. Jesus calms the storm. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There was also other boats with them. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that nearly swamped it. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" He got up, rebuked the wind and the waves. "Quiet, be still." The wind then died down, and it was completely calm. Then he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you not still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Jesus restores a demon-possessed man. They went across the lake to the region of Gerasenes. When Jesus got out the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for he had often been chained hand and foot. But he tore the chains apart and broke the irons on his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Night and day, among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and he fell in front of him. He shouted on the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of this man, you impure spirit." Thanks be to God for this his holy word.
Thanks very much, Ralph. So how is it going with your days for Lent? We're having an interesting experience in my household. The day for day 3 of Lent was surprise someone by doing a chore that they usually do. So Emma's chore in our house is to feed the dogs morning and evening. Adam's chore in our house is to lay the table for supper and then clear it afterwards. So Emma goes to Adam, she says, "Hey Adam, I'll do your chore if you do mine." So we got a little bit of work to do in terms of the spirit behind these days, but we're having a lot of fun. I think yesterday's day was to wash somebody's car for them, and so we're a bit of a day behind on that one, but Emma has roped me in to help her to wash Holly's car this afternoon, so you know what I'll be doing after Sunday lunch today. Friends, we are exploring how we can live courageous lives, unafraid lives, even in the midst of our fears. And today we are exploring fear of the other. Hands up any of you who have experienced recurring nightmares. Those nightmares that you live again and again. Apparently the most common recurring nightmare is to arrive at work or to arrive at school naked, which is supposed to be symbolic of our deep fear of being ill-prepared when we arrive somewhere. I'd like to tell you about a recurring dream that I had for many years. The dream was set in the suburb of my childhood, and so I need to explain to you the suburb that I grew up in. I grew up in a suburb that was located on the eastern slope of the Yixkay River. And the streets of that suburb are laid out in a grid. They're kind of 12 roads in a row, all the way up the slope, parallel to the Yixkay River. Every garden was a neat rectangle of 2,000 square meters. And a ranch-style house in the middle of that garden. Similar in feel, I find, to the suburb of Valhalla, just down the road here. Although Valhalla certainly isn't a rectangle, is it? Very easy to get lost in Valhalla. My house was at one of the roads furthest from the Yexkay River, up at the top of the slope, and facing my suburb on the western slope of the Yexkay River stands the township of Alexandra. And those of you who know Alexandra will know that certainly in the 1970s, when I was growing up, and even today, a slum is a good word to describe what Alexandra is like. 1 square mile with hundreds of thousands of people crammed into that space. In those days, the roads, many of them were dirt, open sewerage flowing down the roads, and so on. Now, as a kid, I used to spend a lot of time riding around the suburb on my bicycle, sometimes riding to a friend's house, sometimes riding with a few friends, sometimes just riding around on my own. So here's the dream, which I would have repeatedly. In some of the dreams, I would be walking around the suburb. In other of my dreams, I would be riding my bicycle. In other dreams, when I was older, I would be driving my car around the suburb. And as I got to the streets lower down the slope, I would suddenly realize that I was no longer in my suburb, but instead I was now in Alexandra Township. I would be gripped with fear. I was lost and could not find my way back to the safety of the streets of my suburb. I would try and head away from the frightening streets of the slum, but at every turn I would find myself instead deeper into the slum-like streets. People are around me, and as they notice my presence, they appear to be menacing. They begin to walk towards me. They close in on me. Whichever direction I turn, I find myself surrounded by people who deepened my fear and my anxiety. And it is at that point that I wake up from my dream. I've often wondered why I had this recurring dream. Perhaps that nightmare was etched into my memory when, as a 5-year-old boy, as the rioting spread from Soweto in 1976 to Alexandra in the aftermath of the 76 uprising, I remember looking across the valley and seeing pillars of black smoke rising from over the air in Alex and hearing gunshots from the same direction. Maybe it was the memory of having my bicycle stolen out of our driveway one afternoon when I had left it there while I went into the house to fetch something to eat, came back outside and it was gone. And my parents explained that it was probably somebody from Alexandra who had been walking the streets, had seen the bicycle and had grabbed it. Maybe it was my mom telling me when I was 8 years old how Uncle Johan, who lived across the road from us, was unable to go to work for several days because he worked in Alexandra, I think at the Department of Native Affairs, it was called in those days, and it was not safe for him to go in. Maybe it was our domestic worker calling me in from where I was playing out on the pavement, telling me in a broken English that I mustn't play there because otherwise the Tutsis from Alex would come and get me. Maybe it was the SABC news broadcasts of the 70s and 80s which really instilled that deep sense of the Swart Gevaar. Probably it was all of these things coming together to plant deep within me a fear of the other. Now here's the amazing thing. 4 years ago, old school friend of mine, actually the friend who introduced me to the woman who's now my wife, so I'm eternally grateful to her. She's visiting me from Scotland, where she now lives. She's staying with Holly and I. And on my day off on a Friday, we say, hey, let's take a drive through to the suburb we grew up in. It'll be fun to just drive around and see the house that I grew up in, see the house a few roads down where she grew up, just check things out. And as we're driving around the suburb, just reflecting on our memories, I share with her this recurring dream that I had. And she goes silent. She says, that's amazing. I had almost the exact same recurring dream when I was a child and into my adulthood, suggesting that some of our deepest fears are placed there by the context that we grow up in. And so we all live with fears of the other. And maybe you want to reflect on who the other is that you are afraid of. But the fear of the other is a universal human experience, whether that be somebody of another nationality, somebody of another religion, somebody of another ethnicity, somebody of another gender, somebody of another orientation, somebody of another political view or language. Fear of the other is part of our human condition. Last week, Bruce reminded us that fear is actually a necessary emotion for our survival. That fear in itself can be a good thing if it's an appropriate fear. That the experience of fear triggers that flight or fight instinct in us, which helps us to survive situations that could be a threat to our survival. But we also discovered last week that many of our fears are irrational at worst, and at best they are magnified beyond what the facts suggest, that they are based on anecdotes or false conclusions. And the example that Bruce gave is the fear of flying. He spoke about the fact that statistically it is safer to climb into an airplane than it is to climb into a car. And yet the fear of flying is far more common than the fear of traveling in a car. I want to suggest to you today that we live in an age of heightened anxiety. That there are factors about our life today which is magnifying our fears beyond what is normal and necessary for our survival, and is leading us to live in states of perpetual anxiety and fear of people around about us. And I want to suggest to you that there are three factors that are feeding into the age of high anxiety that we live in. The first cause of our high anxiety is TMI. Do you know what TMI stands for? Too much information. Too much information. Way back when our ancestors were living in caves, fighting against wild animals or neighboring clans or harsh elements, the prize of survival went to the person who was able to gather the most information about his or her environment, understand the threats to survival, and then respond appropriately. And so our brains have become hardwired to gather as much information about our environment in order to still our fears and to give us the information that we need in order to survive. Which is all very well if the amount of information available to you is similar to the amount of information that was available to your ancestors 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or tens of thousands of years ago. But we live in a world of too much information, don't we? Never before have we had access to so much information about our environment and the threats in it. WhatsApp groups give us real-time updates about the crimes that are taking place in our immediate area. News feeds tell us about the terrible things that human beings are doing to each other in other parts of the world. Videos caught on security cameras of crimes being committed go viral as we watch them with our hardwired compulsion to learn as much as we can about the threats to our environment in order to avoid them. But far from making us feel safer, this glut of information leaves us feeling more fearful, more anxious, more pessimistic, more despairing even, not just about the state of the world, but about the state of human beings. And so fears of others overwhelms us. Here's the second reason why we live in an age of high anxiety. It's something that psychologists call confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is an error that we all make in our thinking, where we have a bias towards, we favor information that confirms the things we already think or believe about other people. So if you want to understand confirmation bias, think of two circles that are overlapping a little bit. And the one circle represents objective facts about a person. The second circle represents the facts that confirm my beliefs. And the area in the middle, the rugby-shaped area that overlap, represents the things that I see and the things that I'm drawn to explore in greater detail that confirm what I believe. So, for example, let's say that I have a belief that Zulu men are stubborn. Have you ever heard of that being expressed? Zulu men are stubborn. Eh? Okay. So every time I'm engaging with Sipiwe, I'm looking for times when Sipiwe is going to show this tray. And in those moments when Sipiwe is assertive, I say, that's because he's a Zulu. Okay. But what will happen is that I will be blind. I won't be as quick to notice those moments where Sipiwe is flexible, where he shows an ability to compromise. Because those examples don't fit the framework in my mind that I have absorbed or that I've built up over the years. The framework that helps me to make sense of the world by putting people into boxes. So here's how confirmation bias works in heightening our fear. Let's say, for example, that I believe that Islam is a violent religion. Muslims are terrorists. So not only do I feel my defense mechanisms going up every time I'm in the presence of somebody who's Muslim, but I'm drawn to news sites and magazines and stories that confirm what I believe about people who are Muslim. If there's a shooting in America, the first thing I ask is, was the gunman a Muslim? I'm blind to the fact that most shootings in America are perpetrated by people who are not Muslim, because that fact doesn't fit my pre-held belief. And so my suspicion of Muslim grows. My fear of Muslim people grows. This confirmation bias contributes to the growing fear that many of us feel of the other. A third factor that heightens our fear of the other is the fear-mongering in political rhetoric. Have you noticed that? You know, fear is one of the most powerful emotions, and it's one of the easiest emotions to trigger. And politicians know this. I want to invite you between now and the 8th of May to just ask yourself a question every time you hear a politician speaking, or watch a political advert, or see a poster on a street lamp. Ask yourself the question, is this political party or is this politician plugging into my fear of the other in order to secure my vote? And I can guarantee you that there'll be many times when politicians will do that. This is not a new thing. It's not unique to South Africa. Aristotle and other ancient Greeks warned of demagogues. And they said that these are leaders who use rhetoric to incite fear for political gain. It's the oldest trick in the book, but it heightens our fears of each other. So TMI, too much information, confirmation bias, fear-mongering of politicians are factors which feed our fear of the other, so that these fears become monsters which lead us to go through life suspicious of others, always on guard, surrounding ourselves with people who are just like us to protect us from the people who are not like us. Now let's turn to the scripture that Ralph read to us, the the story of Jesus and the disciples experiencing a storm on the sea or the lake of Galilee, and of coming across the psychotic man on the other side. Two fears are explicit in that passage. The first fear is the fear that the disciples feel, that the boat is going to capsize and they are going to drown. The second fear that we see is the fear that both the crazy guy and the disciples feel in each other's presence on the other side. I want to suggest to you that there is an unnamed fear in this story. And it's an unnamed fear which we, reading the story 2,000 years later in another culture, miss. But it is a fear which would not have been lost on the audience who was reading this gospel account when it was first written. The fear that I'm talking about is the fear of the people on the other side. Not the fear of the people on the other side of the Yixkay River, but the fear of the people on the other side of the Lake of Galilee. Let me explain to you what I mean. Let me set the context for this gospel reading. This gospel reading happens early on in Mark's gospel. It's the 4th chapter. And for the first 3 chapters, Jesus has been teaching in his home territory of Galilee. And it's not just his home territory, it's the home territory for all of the disciples, who are all Galileans. And at this point, things are going pretty well for Jesus and the 12. Crowds are flocking to Jesus, so much that he's had to push out to lake and teach from the boat. It's been exhilarating stuff. And then out of nowhere, Jesus says to the disciples, let's go over to the other side. Now, in Jesus' day, the other side was more than just a geographical location. It was kind of a technical term for those living on the west side of the Lake of Galilee. And the other side of the lake referred to a region known as the Decapolis. Deca for 10, polis for city. In other words, the place of 10 cities. The Decapolis was regarded as enemy territory. The people there were pagans, people to be feared, people to be suspicious of. Tradition had it that the Decapolis, the other side, was where the 7 nations of Canaan settled when they were driven out of the promised land. The other side was filled with pagan temples. Some of these temples are being excavated today, and we know about that these were cults about violence and unbounded sexuality. The other side was everything that Israel was not. The most repulsive, unclean animal in Israel, the pig, was regarded in Canaanite religion, in the Decapolis, as a sacred animal. The other side was also the place of Roman power. A legion of 6,000 Roman soldiers was based there, the headquarters of Roman oppression. The people on the other side were people to be feared. They were a threat to the purity of the Jewish religion. They were a threat to the survival of the Jewish religion and Jewish culture and the Jewish way of life. The Roman legion was a threat to Jewish nationalistic ideals. The people on the other side were the other who were regarded with fear and suspicion. And so you can imagine what is going through the disciples' minds as Jesus says to them, let us go over to the other side. You can imagine them thinking, Jesus, I don't want to go over to the other side. The people there are unclean. The people there hate us. The people there are a threat to us. The people there won't be open to you, Jesus, like the people on this side are. Why does Jesus say, let us go over to the other side? See, it's almost as if Jesus sees the people on the other side with the same eyes of love that he sees those from Galilee. It's almost as if he believes that he came to earth to proclaim the kingdom of God to them as well. It's almost as if Jesus doesn't see the distinction between them and us. It's almost as if for Jesus there is no them, there is only us. It's almost as if he knows that all the peoples of the earth are going to be blessed through him, even those on the other side. And so Jesus calls them to go over to the other side. Now I want to just move on to reflect on what we are to do with our fear of the other. You know, those fears are real. They are deep. We feel our heartbeat racing. We begin to sweat. We freeze up or we flee. How do we, with the help of God, begin to overcome our fear of the other? Just very quickly, 3 suggestions. Can I suggest, first of all, that we begin to conquer our fears when we ask God to help us to see others as God sees them. You know, one of the ways of thinking about sanctification is to think about it as the process of becoming, of trading in our perspective for God's perspective. That becoming more like Jesus is about surrendering our limited vision and understanding in exchange for a godly vision and wisdom. That becoming holy is about being healed of our sinful ways of looking, our blindness, if you like, and having our eyes open to a godly vision. Yesterday I was watching Alex playing a soccer match at Sport Park in Littleton. And we were watching the soccer match from the side of the field, and we were really enjoying the match from that perspective. And then we heard like a kind of sound a little bit like a mosquito ringing in our ears. And there up in the sky was somebody who was watching the match. Well, he wasn't up in the sky, but there was a drone hovering over the soccer field. And somebody in the side of the field with the visor on and the controls, watching the soccer match from a very different perspective, from the top down. And it's almost as if part of the journey of becoming like Jesus is about putting on spiritual visors so that we begin to see things from God's perspective. And so when we become aware of the people that we are afraid of, we say, God, how do you see that person? Did you create that person in your image? Do you love that person? Do you desire them to be saved? And then we say, Lord, if you made this person in your image, then help me to see you in them. If you love this person, then replace my fear for them with love for them. If you long for this person to know your saving love, then what does it look like to begin to treat them with love instead of fear? You know, Jesus said in Matthew 5 that he said, you've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. So what does it mean to pray for and to love the person who persecutes you, the person whom you fear? We ask for God's help to see others as God sees them. Here's the second thing that we do to overcome our fears. We begin to practice compassionate imagination. Compassionate imagination. Somebody sent me a meme this week that said this. It said, the only regular exercise I get is jumping to conclusions. Doesn't that describe too many of us? You know, there's more to just about any situation than meets the eye. And we as human beings are so good at making assumptions about the other. John Wesley offered 12 rules that all leaders of the Methodist movement needed to observe. And these rules are still read out in the closing ceremony of every synod as synod delegates prepare to return back to the mission field. And I'd like to read to you rule number 5. They're called the rules of the helper. And rule number 5 for helpers is this. Wesley said, believe evil of no one. Unless you see it done, take heed how you credit it. Put the best construction on everything. You know the judge is always supposed to be on the prisoner's side. And so to put the best construction on everything happens when we practice compassionate imagination like this. Say, for example, I fear Nigerians. Okay, I fear Nigerians. And so I practice compassionate imagination when I spend time imagining what it must be like to be a Nigerian in South Africa. To have people always assuming that I'm a drug dealer. To have people always assuming that I am corrupt. To have my children teased and called names. To have people resenting me living in the community that I live in. And as I begin to place myself in the skin of my Nigerian neighbor, I begin to feel compassion for them, and my fear of them subsides. Or I'm afraid of taxi drivers, hey? And so a taxi driver cuts me off in traffic, and in my imagination, I just pause to think of what it must be like to be a taxi driver for a job. The long hours, the low pay, the fear of being a victim of the taxi turf wars, the pressure to fit as many trips into the rush hour as possible, else my boss will fire me. And so I begin to feel the pressure that motivates the taxi driver to drive like he does. It's not that I excuse him breaking the rules of the road. I'm not saying that's okay. But I understand the forces that would lead a person to drive like that. In that classic American book, To Kill a Mockingbird, Scout comes back from the first day of school, and as she and Atticus Finch talk through all of the events of that day, her father tells her, he says, Scout, if you can learn a simple trick, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. He says, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And so we practice compassion as we seek to climb into the other's skin and walk around in it. Friends, the third thing which allays our fears is to engage in intentional conversations and listening to the other. James writes in Scripture, he says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. And so one of the ways to deal with our fear of the other is when we become aware of who that other is, to be intentional about engaging, if not with that person themselves, then with other people who are from that same group. Engage not to convert them, to convince them of how they are wrong, but engage with a view to listen. Now, I want to say to you that is why the growing diversity of the Westview congregation is such a gift. Such a gift. See, it's easy to exist in a bubble of of like-minded people. And as we do so, we begin to fear those that we never listen to, those that we never seek to understand. It's easy to exist in a bubble of like-minded people. It's not easy to follow Jesus in a bubble of like-minded people. So friends, we seek God's help. We ask God to help us to see those we fear as God sees them. Secondly, we practice compassionate imagination as we seek to walk around in the other's skin. And thirdly, we engage in intentional conversations and listening. I wonder what went on in the disciples as a result of their trip over to the other side. You see, years later, when Jesus had returned to heaven and these disciples were now the leaders in the early church, they would gather together for the church's first ever synod called the Council of Jerusalem. The Council of Jerusalem had one agenda. The agenda was to decide whether the other should be included in the household of God, whether Gentiles should be allowed to become part of the Christian church without first converting to Judaism. Could it be that eventful journey across the Lake of Galilee so began a transformation in these rough Galilean men, that when it came time to discern God's will, they were ready to embrace the other and make them part of the household of God? Let us pray.